All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we are diving deep into the heart of French grammar.
Ooh la la. French grammar. It often gets a bit of a fearsome reputation, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. But we're here to demystify it, or at least try to.
We are. It's more approachable than people think. And actually, a lot of fun.
Right. And there are so many cool quirks about it.
Absolutely.
We're going to have a good time. So I think to get us started, one of the biggest hurdles that people encounter is verbs.
French verbs, yes.
Right.
There's something else. I think one of the fascinating things is that French grammar, people think of it as memorizing a bunch of rules, but it really is a window into, the French psyche.
Really?
Because if you think about it, the way that the verbs change for who's doing the action and when they're doing the action,
Oh, yeah.
it shows a real love of precision.
Oh, interesting.
So that's reflected in other parts of, I think, French culture and history as well.
So you're saying that there's a reason that these verbs have so many forms.
Yes, exactly. It's this concept called conjugation, where unlike in English, where verbs mostly stay the same, in French, the verb has to sort of morph almost.
Yeah, they really change.
Yes, to match the who, the when, the how, the why of your sentence. So if you're talking about the past, there's a whole other set of endings. And if you're talking about the future, another set. And then there are moods, like the subjunctive. I mean, it's a whole other thing.
Oh, wow. So how many verb forms are we talking about here?
Well, they have 7 tense aspect mood combinations, I believe. So the tense is when it happens, past, present, future. The aspect is kind of how it happens, ongoing or completed or just starting. And then mood is your attitude toward it, like certainty, possibility, obligation.
Oh my gosh, 7. That's a lot.
It is.
English verbs are looking really good right now.
Yeah.
Super simple. But wait, you said something about French verbs doing a head count. What does that even mean?
Yes. So this is this concept of agreement, and it's something that makes French grammar, I think, both elegant and kind of demanding at the same time, because the verb has to agree with the subject, so its ending changes depending on whether you're saying I or you or hey shite or we or they.
Oh, so it's like the verb is checking everyone's ID at the door.
Yes, exactly. And, a lot of people who are learning French might say, well, why can't it be easier? Why does it have to be so complicated? But I think in linguistics, nothing is arbitrary. And so this agreement is not there to torture language learners. It ensures clarity, especially in really long or complex sentences.
Interesting.
So it's a trade-off, right? Like some languages, they prioritize flexibility so you can move the words around. French, it values this real intricate connection between the verb and the subject.
It's like a choreographed dance.
Exactly.
A grammatical waltz or something.
Yeah. And speaking of teamwork, we can't forget about these auxiliary verbs. These are helping verbs like avoir and être that team up with the main verb to make these compound tenses.
Right, like the passé composé.
Exactly.
That's the first thing you learn in French.
And while, this idea of auxiliaries making compound tenses, this happens in a lot of languages, I think it's interesting, from a bigger picture in terms of linguistics, how humans perceive the passage of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the way these verbs, avoir and être, went from meaning just simple to have and to be to having this grammatical function.
Wow.
It's fascinating.
That is so cool. And then those auxiliaries make the participles agree in compound tenses too, right?
Exactly.
They're like the puppet masters of the French verb world.
They are.
Oh, man, those verbs. And être is also used for the passive voice.
Yes, yes. It's very similar to English in that it's just a slightly different way of conjugating things, but
Right.
yeah.
French verbs are quite the workout for the brain. But I have a feeling nouns might give them a run for their money. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. They're a whole other ballgame. Just when you think you've got a handle on French verbs, the nouns decide to shake things up.
Right. And what better way to do that than with grammatical gender?
Ah, yes. The infamous grammatical gender.
Every noun has to be either masculine or feminine, even if it has nothing to do with being a person. It's like, is that table over there feeling more like a he or a she today? Who knows?
You've got to love it. It keeps you on your toes. But it's not just about memorizing whether it's le or la.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That gender impacts articles, adjective endings, the whole shebang.
It really does. The grammatical gender in French is woven into the very essence of the language.
And to make it even trickier, or maybe more fun, depending on how you look at it, the gender of a word can actually change its entire meaning.
Oh, 100%.
It's amazing. Like le critique versus la critique. Same word, different gender, totally different meaning. One means a male critic. The other is the concept of criticism. How wild is that?
You're speaking my language now. Those little quirks are what makes exploring French so fascinating. And it highlights how grammatical gender isn't some random rule thrown in to confuse people. It's integral to how the language functions, how meaning is created and understood.
So this isn't just some weird French thing. This grammatical gender exists in other languages too.
Absolutely. It might seem strange from an English-speaking perspective, but you find grammatical gender in many language families across the globe. Indo-European languages, for example, French, Spanish, Italian, they've all got it, each with its own history and evolution, of course. It's a fascinating look at how languages have developed over time.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it, but let's be real, trying to memorize the gender of every single French noun out there, that's a recipe for a meltdown.
I hear you. It can definitely feel overwhelming. It's not like there's always a clear-cut rule book.
Right.
But there are some helpful patterns. Nouns ending in E, for instance, they tend to be feminine, although it wouldn't be French without a few exceptions to keep things interesting.
Of course. Got to keep us on our toes. But I'm curious, do you think this whole grammatical gender thing, do you think it actually changes how French speakers see the world?
Now, there's a question that's been debated by linguists for ages. It's fascinating, isn't it? To think that simply assigning a gender to an object could influence our perception of it. Do French speakers view bridges as inherently more feminine because it's le pont? Who knows? It makes you think.
It really does. It's amazing how languages can shape our thinking in subtle ways. But before we get too philosophical, let's talk about those plural forms. At first glance, seems simple enough, right? Just slap an S on the end and you're good to go.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
But this is French we're talking about.
Exactly. And as with most things in French grammar, it's not always as straightforward as it seems. For starters, that plural S, you usually don't even say it.
Ah, yes, those silent letters, always lurking, waiting to trip us up.
They do love their silent letters. So you might write fenêtre for the plural of fenêtre, which means window. But the pronunciation remains virtually unchanged. And that, my friend, is one of the key characteristics of French. This lack of a distinct audible difference between the singular and plural forms. It's all about the rhythm and flow. It can be quite the challenge for learners who are used to hearing that clear plural marker.
It's like a secret code. You have to know the rules to unlock the true meaning. And then, just when you think you're getting the hang of those silent plural S, French throws another curveball. Irregular plurals.
Why not?
Why not indeed? We've got words like Yule, meaning grandfather, which decides it wants to be AU in the plural. Or how about E for I, transforming into you?
It's enough to make your head spin.
It certainly keeps things interesting. And while we're on the topic of those silent letters doing their thing, can we talk about liaisons for a second?
Ah, yes, liaison.
They're like those ninjas of French pronunciation, just blending into the background, then suddenly, bam, they spring into action.
That's a great way to put it. You see, with liaisons, a consonant at the end of a word, normally minding its own business, decides to make a sound when the next word begins with a vowel. It's all about maintaining that smooth musical flow that French is famous for.
French pronunciation really is like a carefully choreographed dance, isn't it? With all these subtle steps and flourishes.
Precisely. But that's part of what makes it so captivating. It's a dance worth learning, for sure.
It certainly is. Now, from one set of tricky characters to another, let's talk about French articles. Don't let their size fool you. These little words are doing a lot of heavy lifting in French grammar.
They really are the unsung heroes, aren't they? Small but mighty.
Absolutely. We're talking about lo, la, un, in.
And all their variations, right?
Exactly.
Even after years of learning French, I still catch myself stumbling over those articles sometimes.
You're not alone. It's a common struggle, especially because English doesn't have a direct equivalent. So it requires a different way of thinking about how to use them. But once you get a feel for it, it just clicks. It's all about context, right?
Right.
Like, are you talking about something specific or general? Have you mentioned this thing before, or is this something new? That's where la and la come in for specific things. And then you have un and un when you're introducing something new or talking more generally.
Exactly, you've got it. And then, of course, just to add another layer, you have the partitive article. Now, there's a fun one.
Oh, the partitive article. Trying to explain the concept of to someone who's never encountered it before, it's a real challenge.
It's a whole new way of looking at quantities. It's used when you're talking about a part of a whole, a quantity that's not specifically defined, you know, like du pain, some bread, or de la musique. The music. And then to make it even more interesting, using it with uncountable nouns, well, that's a whole other grammatical adventure.
You can say that again. But hey, it keeps things lively.
Hey.
All right, so we've got articles somewhat figured out, and then naturally, French throws another curveball. Adjective agreement.
Because why not?
Why not indeed? Those adjectives, they just have to match the noun they're describing in both gender and number. No exceptions. So not only do you have to pick the right gender for the noun, but then the adjective has to follow suit. And let's not forget about those silent E endings on adjectives. They love to keep us guessing.
It's all about creating that beautiful harmony. That's what French is all about.
The symphony of grammar. And speaking of harmony, we can't forget about those rule-breaking adjectives, the ones that like to go before the noun instead of after.
Oh, yes, those rebels, always shaking things up.
But luckily, we've got that handy acronym BEGAJIC S to help us remember some of those common ones. Beauty, age, good as size. It's a lifesaver.
It really is. Those little tricks of the trade can make all the difference.
So we've navigated the maze of French verbs and nouns, but what about asking questions? Is it as simple as tacking a question mark at the end of a sentence and calling it a day?
If only it were that easy. While written French might share that similarity with English, spoken French is a whole other ballgame.
Ah, because intonation plays such a crucial role, right?
You got it. The way your voice rises and falls, it can completely change the meaning of a sentence.
It's like music.
Exactly. Take a simple phrase like, tu parles français. Depending on how you say it, it could either be a statement, you speak French, or a question, do you speak French? It's all in the delivery.
So you're telling me there's more to it than just raising your voice at the end of a sentence?
Absolutely. French has a few tricks up its sleeve. One way to form a question is by using the trusty phrase est-ce que at the beginning. Think of it as a universal question starter pack.
A question starter pack. I like it.
So instead of just saying, tu aimes le chocolat, you like chocolate, you would say, est-ce que tu aimes le chocolat? It adds a touch of politeness and clarity, especially in formal situations.
Got it. So, est-ce que, a handy little tool to have in your French arsenal. But I've also heard of this thing called inversion, where you switch the verb and subject around, like saying, aimes-tu le chocolat instead of tu aimes le chocolat.
You're right on the money. Inversion is another way to phrase those yes-no questions. And it's considered more formal, more elegant, more, dare I say, French.
Fancy.
Exactly. It's like the grammatical equivalent of putting on a beret and sipping an espresso in a Parisian cafe.
Ooh la la. But I imagine mastering that inversion, it takes a bit of practice, right? Especially with those pesky pronouns and silent letters always lurking about.
You're not wrong. French pronunciation can be a delightful dance with all its nuances and flourishes.
Speaking of delightful dances, we can't forget about those essential question words. The who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. They're like the building blocks of curiosity.
They are. And just like with our yes-no questions, you've got options when it comes to using these question words. You can stick with a more straightforward word order. For example, tu fais quoi? What are you doing?
Just simple enough.
Or you can step it up a notch and go for that more formal vibe with inversion. That would be que fais-tu?
Ah, the elegance of inversion. I'm sensing a pattern here.
There's a reason French is considered such a precise and nuanced language. Even when asking questions, there's an art to it. And this attention to structure, it highlights something fascinating about French grammar, the prominence of the subject.
The subject always takes center stage, huh?
Exactly. Even in questions, French tends to keep that focus on the subject of the sentence. It's a subtle difference, but it speaks volumes about the nature of the language.
Fascinating. So we've got those basic question structures down. But is there a way to add a little extra oomph, to really emphasize a specific part of a question?
You're thinking like a true French speaker. And the answer is a resounding oui. French has a rather elegant tool for adding that emphasis, and it's called cleft sentences.
Cleft sentences. They always sounded a bit intimidating to me, to be honest.
But they're not as scary as they sound. Think of it this way. You're cleaving or splitting a regular sentence to shine a spotlight on a specific word or phrase.
Like a grammatical spotlight. I like it.
Exactly. So instead of simply saying j'aime le chocolat, I like chocolate, you could say c'est le chocolat que j'aime. It's chocolate that I like.
Ah, I hear the emphasis. You're really putting that chocolate front and center.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And here's where French gets even more interesting. You've got different types of cleft sentences. Subject clefs, like the example we just mentioned, complement clefs, and even adverbial clefs.
Adverbial clefs. No, those are fancy.
They are, and they're quite common in French, which makes them all the more intriguing.
Wow. Who knew there was so much to discover about asking questions in French?
Language is full of surprises, isn't it? It's a constant journey of exploration.
It certainly is. Well, there you have it, folks. From those ever-changing verbs to those gender-bending nouns and those question formations that are all about rhythm and emphasis, we've journeyed through the ins and outs of French grammar. It's been quite the adventure, wouldn't you say?
It has indeed. But remember, mastering any language, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So be kind to yourselves, celebrate those victories along the way, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, au revoir and bon courage in all your French learning adventures.